Thank you, Lori, for all your hard work on this program, and welcome to everyone who's joined us. We were so excited. I was personally so excited to have Sister Nancy join us, find out why throughout our presentation. And this first Witness and Grace Conversations with Sister program has had such a wonderful response. We had more than, I think, 1,200 registrants. And we actually held a second session this morning and have put it out on YouTube. And I'll be writing a short blog about it for Global Sisters Report for those who couldn't attend, and there'll be a recording as well. So we closed the chat room and again muted everyone so we can fully focus on this presentation, and letting you know that we've incorporated the questions that you sent ahead of time into the program. And we'll also be following up with an email that includes the author names and the resources that are referenced by Sister Nancy, so you needn't worry about taking notes. So now I'd invite you to take a deep breath and hold it for just about 10 or 15 seconds or so. And release it. So we will have time in this session for a group contemplative practice, and that will constitute our prayer. And I do indeed pray that the Holy Spirit be with us during this time together. Our presenter today is very familiar to Global Sisters Report readers. Sister Nancy Sylvester, an Immaculate Heart of Mary sister from Monroe, Michigan, has been writing a monthly column for us since we began in 2014, and she remains one of our most popular columnists. When you read Contemplate This, you realize that Sister Nancy lives out her spirituality totally integrated with her life. She's been an educator. She was head of Network, which is a national Catholic social justice lobby, an elected leader of her own congregation, served as president of the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, and is founder of the Institute for Communal Contemplation and Dialogue. Yet with all of that activity, and she's always very busy, you get a sense of someone who's quite busy and quite active, but focuses and is passionate about the power and the importance of contemplation. So to begin, I'm going to ask a simple question, Sister Nancy, which is, what drew you to contemplation, to this form of prayer?
Oh, thank you, Gail. And really, first, let me just thank you for this invitation to address so many friends of Global Sisters Report and National Catholic Reporter. You know, it's funny, every time I sit to write this column every month, I sort of try to imagine who might be reading it. And today, it is such a thrill to take a look at some of the faces, and I suspect some of you do read the column. So I now will have my audience and my readership right in front of me. So I just want to thank you for that. So back to your question, what drew me to contemplation? Well, actually, it's a life journey, so it's a long story. All my experiences brought me to embrace contemplation as central to my life. So I'm really glad we had the questions beforehand, because it really could take up the whole hour and more. So this way I'm able to just focus on some of the things that I think were essential in my life journey. And when I share this, I really want you to be thinking about your own. You don't have to listen to everything I say. Hopefully what will happen is something will resonate with you, and you'll begin to say, aha, that's similar to my journey. Or, you know what, just now I'm feeling this. And so see what is drawing you to contemplation. So I'll share mine, and hopefully you'll be starting to connect with your own. Well, my way of praying that sustained me very fine when I was growing up. I grew up as a Catholic Chicago girl in the 1950s, 60s. And it was a very traditional time. In fact, I always say I was a very pious child, but I loved the prayers. It was truly a God and me kind of spirituality, a relationship that I used to say I just sort of prayed in the closet. You know, it was just private, very private. And I was comfortable with the articulated theology that shaped those prayers. But then the Second Vatican Council happened. Now, as I sort of looked at some of the faces, some of you will remember that in the early 60s. Some of you will not. But that was a time when the church opened the window, so to speak, of an institution that had pretty well not changed since the Middle Ages. And so in formation, I was exposed to what then was called new theology, new philosophy. as well as the Catholic social justice teaching. Now, these are encyclicals or letters that the popes have written, beginning with Leo XIII back in 1891. And what they do is really address our faith in relationship to workers' rights, economic justice, international peace, political responsibility. It shows the connection of our faith to our world. And so what started to happen in me was a shift. It went from a God and me piety to a God and me and the world kind of spirituality. And as this awareness took hold, I became involved with the anti-war movement as I was finishing my undergraduate degree in St. Louis. Also, I got involved with the feminist movement and civil rights. So in addition to taking part of demonstrations and strikes, and then 15 years in Washington, D.C. to try to change public policy for those who are the least served in our world and in our country, I was also reading the theology that was arising from these movements. Some of you probably were well versed in liberation theology. And then there was a whole series of what is called contextual theology. So that's feminist theology, womanist theology, mujerista theology, Black theology, and later more of the eco-spirituality. So I was attracted in a way to poets as well, because I found in some poets a real understanding of the divine and expressed in such a more alive manner and a more holistic manner. One in particular early on was a Jesuit, a name that may ring a bell for some, Anthony de Mello. He was from India, and he brought some of the insights of Eastern spirituality, and he was quite the poet. And then having been introduced to Thomas Merton early on in my formation, I was so taken with his journals and how he could integrate his mysticism with poetry, but also offered truly another understanding of how one can come to know God. Now later, during those years, I read Ken Wilber, his integral theory, discovered spiral dynamics with Don Beck. I began to realize that as my consciousness continued to develop, so did my interpretation of the divine. And so I continued to deepen my understanding of Teilhard de Chardin and evolutionary theory, which helped me to rethink how the divine mystery permeates the universe, the new universe story. I became familiar with principles of quantum physics, which helped me see that we are all connected, that we really are a web of life, that we can live out of a both and world, and that I could embrace change at the only constant. Now, Gail, I may have told you this before, but when I was little, I always wanted to be perfect. And of course, in our tradition, perfection meant no change. So I tell you, it was really hard to start to shift that in me, to see that change is probably the way to perfection, if there is a way at all, and that it is the only constant. So in many ways, these experiences for me were of God. And although not everyone would think they could fit into Catholicism, I believed they could and that they can. And possibly for me, what's so critical in that belief is that I never thought I wasn't given the gift of faith, even though it changed pretty radically in how I would articulate it or interpret it. So during these years, I'd have to say my prayer life was getting a little stagnant. You know, the formal prayers were difficult for me as my feminist and social consciousness grew stronger. My rational mind, my reason, would just argue with all the words and concepts embodied in scholastic philosophy that shaped Catholic thought. My major was philosophy down in St. Louis, and so I was sort of schooled in some of this, but it would just drive me nuts. I'd have to interpret everything I was trying to pray, which really takes away from the act of adoration or thanksgiving, all of our ways that we want to pray. So what I found myself is just sitting daily. Now, I didn't have a prayer style to speak of. And I was committed just to give time to God, because in our constitutions or our rule of life, we were to pray daily. And I couldn't pray all those recommended prayers, but I could give time to God. So then in the early 90s, I found a spiritual director who had been reading many of these same authors that I had. And so she became my annual retreat director for the past almost 30 years. The very first retreat, she told me to bring nothing to read. If I had to bring something, bring poetry. Not the scripture, not any prayer books, and certainly no theology or philosophy texts. She invited me to just be. She invited me to become aware of what goes on inside of me. She had the needed skills in both psychology and spiritual direction to guide me through the very challenging discovery of myself into what today we call the true self, what Thomas Merton called the diamond self. She invited me to meet divine mystery in a very deep place of silence, and she set me on the contemplative path. And then I became acquainted with the writings of Constance Fitzgerald, a marvelous woman. She's a cloistered Carmelite nun in Baltimore, Maryland. She understands contemplation in a dynamic and transformative way. And then Cynthia Bourgeot, whom many of you may not have heard of, Episcopal priest, sort of a modern day mystic, a real teacher of the centering prayer, and as also with Richard Rohr in his School of Theology, whose writings were so challenging and resonated with me. Now that was my personal journey, but it became more than that. You know, by the time I gave my address to the Leadership Conference of Women Religious in 2000, it didn't surprise me that I said that many women religious were at an impasse with those in the hierarchy of the church. And all the ways we knew how to respond no longer worked. We had to imagine new ways of being and acting that came from the deepest part of ourselves, from our contemplative self. And in that assembly, the sisters voted to incorporate contemplation as a way to begin to address the misuse of power within the church. So I knew that contemplation could play a role in transformation. And so it was when I left leadership the next year that I founded the Institute for Communal Contemplation and Dialogue. So Gail, that's sort of what drew me to contemplation.
Well, that's a wonderful story and a deep, indeed, and interesting, fascinating journey. I'm going to ask a simple question. Journalists often step back and ask the simple question. And some of you may groan a little bit, but I really want to understand, for those of us who are, and I consider myself new at it still, what exactly is contemplation? And then how does it invite transformation? I'm really working with that.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you asked that, because I still remember this one time looking at the TV and seeing this ad, and these fellas in business suits were standing around saying, okay, we're going to contemplate our next marketing effort. You know, and I think, oh heavens, how words get so used up, misused, and we all are thinking something different. And of course, we hear that today all over the place when all the various political divisions say one thing and we all interpret it differently. So thank you for this question. Contemplation simply is a form of prayer. Contemplation awakens in us a new awareness of the divine indwelling. Cynthia Bourgeot says it rather well. She says, when I go into myself, my center, my own being and the divine being become more and more mysteriously interwoven. My own nature, who I am in my core, and the divine being who is also within me become more and more mysteriously interwoven. So contemplation invites us to that more direct experience of God. Now, when I was growing up, we didn't learn contemplation. In fact, contemplation was seen as a very special gift given to the few, and they usually then entered cloistered religious congregations. And they were sort of away from the world. And for many people, they thought contemplation was passivity. Well, That's not really true. And it certainly is not how we're living it out today. But in fact, way back in our history, the early desert fathers and monks were already practicing contemplation. And in this last century, it really has started coming back to more of our consciousness. And some of these names you might recognize. John Main, who brought back the mantra, the breathing technique. Thomas Keating, I suspect a lot of you have heard of and or are followed centering prayer. Thomas Merton, of course, who was so essential. And for religious congregations, back in the 60s, there was a house of prayer movement that actually two of the IHM sisters of Monroe, Margaret Brennan and Ann Chester, really helped to lead. So Thomas Merton was very key in that, to get active apostolic religious returning to that contemplative source. Evelyn Underhill, you might not know, she's an English Christian Catholic, but she has written extensively on mysticism. And then Cynthia Bourgeault, a modern day mystic, Episcopal priest that I've already mentioned. But they started to bring forward again the Christian contemplative tradition. Now, there are many reasons why contemplation was not taught through the centuries to the average person. But I do think one of the reasons it's returning, well, actually two reasons. One is I think there is such a hunger today for spirituality, a spirituality that can make sense of what we know through science about our world today. It's a spirituality that is saying, look, we don't want to be just isolated. My achievements alone are not enough to give me meaning. And so what we're doing is we're really coming out of the extremes of what we have come to call modernity, the great individualism. And we really are needing to see that there's more to life. Look at the suicide rates that are happening among young people as well as older. And the second reason is because I believe with the onset of psychology in the 20th and 21st centuries, we have come to understand the importance of psychology with our spiritual development. As one enters into that process of discovering one's true self, one has to have a pretty healthy ego and must understand some of the implications. And so that integration, I think, has really helped us to be able to say it can be for everyone. In fact, Evelyn Underhill wrote in the 1950s that mysticism is the birthright of every Christian. And I think now we are able to really invite people into that process. So what might be the key characteristics of contemplative prayer? It's a prayer without words and without images. So some of you might, if you haven't done this, might think this is really, it's sort of empty, right? Like you're just sort of empty your brain. But it's not quite. It's not an emptiness. But it's another way of saying it is a non-discursive form of prayer. You don't want to use your intellect or your emotions. Now, not because those aren't good. They're just different. And they already bring that developed interpretive lens to your experience. If you remember in my little sharing of what drew me, there came a time when the prayers that I was saying were stumbling blocks to me, because the kind of interpretation of every one of those words was very difficult for me. And so I couldn't do it. So in contemplation, you let that go. You really are entering a much freer, in some ways, experience. You simply enter into the presence of the divine. You enter into a deep stillness and try to quiet your mind. You don't look for answers to your problems, and you don't wait to hear a response from God. Now that's very different than how some of us learn to pray. And I remember often praying, sort of not betting with God exactly, but it was like, if I do this, then will you do this? And I saw that, so that must mean I can do this. And it was this kind of, it was a very useful prayer for me at the time, but it certainly was me trying to control God in all of that marvelous prayer time. So here you don't look for answers to problems. It doesn't happen when you're in your contemplative sitting. Rather, you become totally present to this moment. And we know how hard that is. especially even during this COVID time, when you might be home, sometimes more alone. You might be more connected with all your devices because everyone's contacting you. I mean, a lot of you, I'm sure, are like zoomed out. So I appreciate you coming on today. But we have to become present to this moment. We don't have to worry about what we could have done, should have done, would have done. We're present to the now. You simply surrender to God working within you. You are moving from ordinary awareness to spiritual awareness to divine awareness. One of the questions was around Lectio Divina, and let me just address that for a minute in contemplation. For those of you who practice Lectio, you know contemplation is the fourth sort of phase of that process. You begin by reading the scripture, then you meditate on it, using your imagination, using your thought processes. Then you go to oratio, where you actually let those words and images touch your heart, and then you express it in words as a prayer. And the final stage is that of contemplation, where your mind and emotions are stilled and you rest in the presence of the divine. Lectio has been a long tradition, especially within the Benedictine monasteries. However, in our own sort of broader Catholic tradition, it got sort of stuck in meditatio, the meditation. And probably that was when we thought of contemplation as a very special gift, an infused gift. And so now today we see it in a much different context. So Lectio is a marvelous way to bring you to contemplation. So contemplation is a process and it takes time. Someone always asked, how long does it take? Well, are there benchmarks? Well, I laugh a little bit because I think it takes a long time letting God be God in you. And a lot of it depends on personality, you know, your Myers-Briggs, your Enneagram number, and the seriousness of our intent to explore how our inner life as we keep falling deeply into God's love. As far as a benchmark, well, that's hard, but I think it's connected to the transformative process.
Well, it's interesting. You know, you mentioned how stressful a time that we are in now, and I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about transformation and contemplation and how that might be helpful given these times. You know, those of us who maybe are not in a regular practice might want to adopt one.
Oh, that's a great question and a great sort of thought to ponder. We are in an extremely difficult time. In fact, the more, I don't know if anyone has read the last two columns, these last 2 months, but trying to grapple again with how we see the world with so many different worldviews. Mm-hmm. We are looking at the same reality, and we are in completely different camps. It's not even just two camps, it's multiple camps. And how we sort of have blinders on. And what happens is you sort of listen to the news with your own perspective, and how angry we get. I don't know how many about you, but you know, sometimes I'm yelling at the television, not truly. I sometimes yell at Siri on my phone, who doesn't do something for me. But this is like, you just can find yourself enraged sometimes. And that really isn't very helpful. And in fact, it's putting into the energy field the same toxicity that is causing you to do that. So on a very human, biological, practical level with no spirituality attached, sitting quietly for a few moments every day or minutes is very healthy for us. You sometimes will see mindfulness on the cover of Time magazine or people talking about it. And sometimes mindfulness, meditation, contemplation all get conflated. But just to think about it as a silencing of yourself, you're bringing yourself present to the moment. You're slowing down your breathing. They say in 5 seconds, 5 minutes, your blood pressure goes down. In 20 minutes, your brain waves modify. So even without a spiritual practice, resting one's mind is healthy and good for us. So I'd encourage that across the board. But for those who practice contemplation with an explicit spiritual dimension, I think this is a very powerful time. I think what we can do is draw on the energy that is generated when we bring to our collective awareness our alignment with divine love, with divine mystery, with God. Knowing that we are moving toward the omega point of Teilhard de Chardin, or the kingdom of God that Jesus taught, we begin to actualize our potential to generate this next more complex and diverse stage of evolution. And this will inform our practical actions. So somehow we'll be able to respond in ways that would contribute to the healing of the whole. Now, let me say here that contemplation's transformative power is really what the Institute's current program, Enter the Chaos, Engage the Differences to Make a Difference, focuses on. It really tries to explore how does the transformative power of contemplation, together with the transformation of our consciousness, and here we use the insights and wisdom of spiral dynamics integral. How does that help us evolve a new reality aligned with divine mystery? Now, I hope some of you may be interested in participating in that program, as we will be having 3 programs on Zoom in the coming months. And a little commercial, I will include that in the follow-up mailing. But you know, Gail, I want to turn the tables on you a bit. You know, you asked the question, but you participated in one of those programs. So as you think about that experience in Enter the Chaos, could you share some of the insights you have, and or what are you still carrying with you from that experience?
Sure. In fact, that's why for this first Witness and Grace program, I so wanted you to be our guest, Nancy, because I wanted to share what I experienced. I was really, really blessed to be a participant in that February workshop of Enter the Chaos. And the timing couldn't have been better. It was before a trip to Israel with my younger sister, with whom
Oh, lovely.
And also, it was also with before the course of the pandemic, you know, was just starting to really get serious and getting a lot of attention. So I really wanted to be able to be grounded. And the sessions really did 3 things for me, and that I still carry with me. And first, I mean, and most important, it deepened my appreciation about the importance of contemplative practice. I'll admit that I will describe myself as a contemplative wannabe. I want to do this more regularly. I know it would be good for me to do it. I know I want to get closer to God and feel that divine presence, but I just don't always take the time to do it. And since that workshop, I've actually been scheduling it in my daily to-do list. I mean, in my to-do list with all my meetings, I actually include, you know, time for contemplative prayer or practice. And so I've scheduled it in. And for me, midday works well. The mornings I'm just busy, and I, you know, kind of I have other prayer practices I do, and I need to get on with my day. But I find that a midday break for me works well because it focuses me and helps me re-energize me for the rest of the day. So that's one of the first things. I also want to say, Nancy, that it also changed my perspective on this. I had always thought about this type of prayer as pretty binary. It was me and the divine presence, and you talk about this. But one of the things I took away from the workshop is that before I enter into that contemplative time, I now take just a moment to think of all the others in the world who may be also entering into this contemplative space or already at that same time. And that helps me to feel connected on this spiritual plane. So the third thing I'll say is that when I do this practice more regularly, I find that I am more grounded. I'm less reactive because I tend to, you know, respond to things quickly. And that is truly a benefit in this time of such tension and such stress. I find myself yelling at the television a lot. So anyway, I think those are the things that I took away from it.
Well, thank you, Gail. You know, it's always great that when you talk to someone who's done a program, they actually remember some of the things you hope they would remember. So thank you for sharing that. And I do want to pick up on 2 of them. The last one first. You know, this awareness of being aware of what you're going to do before you do it and not be as reactive, I think is really critical, because that question about transformation you asked a little bit earlier, you're not aware of that happening when you're sitting. It really happens after. That's when you become aware of your own biases or assumptions, worldview, and how that shapes your relationship with God and with the world. and you become aware of your own needs and fears and how that shapes who God is for you. You know we all come, as I mentioned earlier, sort of with blinders on. And so as we're looking at the world, you look at Black Lives Matter, you look at police, the police brutality or violence. You've got two issues, and we are looking at them from very different worldviews and very different places. We need to become aware of our own personal biases and assumptions before we can engage the other in a conversation that will bring us to a new place of healing. And at some point, after sitting for a while, you really become more vulnerable and willing to act, to let go and allow the divine mystery to work within you. And eventually, you really enter and experience God dwelling within you, and you're aware of your true self. So then you have a different way of seeing, a different way of being and acting. We say sometimes you see with your heart, that your heart becomes an organ of perception. Now, not the emotions here, but it's a different understanding. And you are ready to respond out of Christ consciousness. And then, Gail, you mentioned this idea that you're conscious of other people when you sit. And that just reminded me about that question someone asked about virtual networks. Mm-hmm. That could you, if you're geographically spread out and pray together, can that be an agent of change? Well, I think that's an important question. And we're still really learning a lot about that. But the more we learn through quantum physics about energy and energy fields and how we truly are all connected, I do believe that when people consciously set the intention, intention, to be open to the divine working within us for the transformation of the world, something shifts. We are really seeding the morphogenetic field of humanity with compassion, equanimity, and love. We really are aligning ourselves with divine mystery, with divine love. We are contributing, I believe, to the next stage of evolutionary consciousness. And I think what quantum physics is giving us a 21st century underpinning for what we always knew as intercessory prayer. That truly, when we pray, there is an effect. And there are lots of studies being done, monitoring the brain during meditation. I know the Dalai Lama has been involved with urging that in many places. The Institute of the Heart Math Organization also is interested in what's the effect of meditation on the person. And then I remember now quite a few years ago, but a whole group of meditators coming out of the TM movement, you might remember Transcendental Meditation, wanted to come together, and they came to Washington, DC, maybe about 1,000 of them. And they thought if they could pray for a couple of weeks, a couple times a day, would they affect the rate of the violent crime going on? Now, they were in the same city, but they weren't all in the same physical place in the city. And they did this, and they actually were able to test through some scientific method that the crime rate reduced about 23%.
Interesting.
So I think you're not wasting your time if you sit with others, even virtually. Mm-hmm. And in fact, ICCD has a virtual contemplative sitting network that you might want to join. We have over 1,000 people in 23 countries who sit for 20 minutes a day with the intention of having God work within us for the transformation of the world. And that'll be in the follow-up as well.
That's great.
That's a little bit about, I think, transformation.
Well, that's terrific. Thank you, Sister Nancy. Very, very helpful. I'm wondering, and one of the things I'm curious about is, again, as a newbie, if you can share some examples in your own life about the importance of this practice. I mean, do you ever miss a day? And like, you do. I mean, what's so different?
Well, I have to say I do. I try not to, but I do. And I try to sit twice a day. But I'll tell you, it's not nice. It's not very nice to see. You could probably ask the 4 other sisters I live with that when on those days, I'm a little bit out of sorts, you know, when I don't take my 20 minutes in the morning or longer. I find myself more irritable. I'm less patient. I start feeling overwhelmed at how my day is shaping up before I even start it. I start feeling worried about things that I don't have to worry about. It's my ego trying to take control, I think. She always is trying to sneak in, you know, and for part of your life, your ego needs to shape you. But at a certain time, your true self needs your ego, but in a very different way. And so I always keep watching that. I sort of lose perspective because my I becomes too important. I don't feel grounded. and I'm not really awake to how my ego is trying to wrest back control. So that may be more than you need to know about my personal stuff, but it isn't very nice.
No, I think it's helpful. It's helpful to know, sometimes the importance of something when you don't do it, and what difference that makes. So no, I think that is helpful. So one of the things, I think we're about done with the questions that we have time for. But you had offered, Sister Nancy, to have us have an experience with contemplative sitting. And so would you be willing to do that with us now?
Oh, Gail, I'd be honored. I know many of you already have a contemplative practice, but for those who may still be wondering, what does this feel like? I'd like us to experience a contemplative sit. Now we're going to sit together. Let me just check my clock here. Oh, we'll probably go close between, a good 10 minutes at least, but that's not long. But if you've never really silenced your mind, it might feel like forever. So you never know. Some days it goes very easily and some days it doesn't. For those who are new, I want to suggest 2 contemplative practices from which to choose. Both involve the silence. And actually in the whole tradition, silence is a key part of contemplation. But one is the use of the mantra. So it's John Main's bringing back into the Christian, Catholic, Western tradition, the use of following your breath, but also following your breath with very simple words. So when you're sitting, you start to breathe the intake and the out breath, sort of how Gail had us begin this at the very beginning of the session. You can say words like Jesus in the in breath and mercy, out breath. Jesus, mercy. So whenever there's a distraction, what you do is you return to your breath and your mantra. A simple mantra, not many words. And what that does is it refocuses you. And then you keep your attention, attention, on the breath, on the mantra. So every time you get distracted, you return to that and you stay with it. The second is a little different. And this is from centering prayer that Thomas Keating brought back. Centering prayer has its roots in a 13th century mystical text called the Cloud of Unknowing. And what this is, you get a word. So words involved. It's a very simple word, often 1 syllable or 2. My word is trust. So you start, of course, you start with the breathing because you want to get your energy flowing. But then I say trust, and in this kind of reverential way. And then I let it go. The important thing is you let it go. You don't keep returning to that word and stay with it like you do your breath. You return to the word after a distraction, but then you let it go. So the whole thing is much more kenotic, the kenosis of Jesus. Think of the epistle. He gave his whole nature up to be from God and he became human. It's a giving up. It's a dropping down. It's a letting go. So it's more like a placeholder. So as a thought, idea, or an itch starts to capture your attention, you either take your attention back to your breath and mantra, hold it and keep following it, or you take it back to your word, say the word and let it go. You can do that as many times as you need to. In fact, Thomas Keating would always say, if you did it 10,000 times, that's 10,000 times you keep going back to God. So either one of those. Now, for the rest of you who have your own contemplative practice, either one of those or some variation, please do that. So right now, what I want you to do is to choose one of those 2 ways, especially those who've never done it before, the mantra breath or the word. So I'm just be quiet for a couple of moments, get in touch with which one you want to do for this next period of time. Now, get yourself comfortable in whatever chair you're sitting in. You want to sort of sit up straight because think of your energy flowing through from your feet all the way to the crown of your head. And you want that breath coming in and out, regardless of which of the practices you're going to follow. So get there, ground yourself, we say, so feel that energy. And then what's most important before we begin the actual sit is you need to set your intention, intention, to be open to God working within you for the transformation of the world. You set that intention and then you let it go, because that's what's going to hold you through all the distractions, even as you keep coming back to your word, to your mantra. So set your intention at this point. Now, for those of you who are able to bring a candle, would you take it now and get your matches? Now, I hope, Lori, if you're here, you told me that we might have to click our, I want you to look at each other. So you might have to click on again what is called your gallery view up in the, usually it's the right-hand corner. Now, computers differ, of course, so I'm not exactly sure, but try to find that gallery view. Because after we light our candle, we're going to hold it for just a few moments. And I'd ask you just to go through a couple of the various gallery views. You know, you have a little arrow on the right. We have 32 pages. Well, we won't be able to get through all of us. But we're not doing this alone. We are really doing it as a community around the world. We're sitting for the next 10 minutes with that intention of opening ourselves to the work of God within us for the transformation of our world. And I want us to feel that we are a we. It's not just each individual I. So if you would take your matches, and if you can balance everything, light your candle, and then bring it back up to the camera part of your computer. We're going to do this, of course, we're all muted, so it is silent, just for a few moments. And then I'm going to invite you to put your candle down, and I'll gong us, and then we'll sit, and then I'll bring you back out with the gong as well. So again, hold the candle up, but be able to see some of the people, and just go through maybe 5 or so slides, looking at all of us who are joining together at this moment. We are truly a we. So let's put your candle down in a safe place so you don't get burnt. Be aware of how you're going to practice. The intention is set. As you bring your awareness back to the center here, just get in touch with how that felt for you. How was that experience sitting there? I'd like to close then with a quotation from Constance Fitzgerald, the cloistered Carmelite whom I mentioned earlier. It's a prayer that I'll draw from one of her talks. Our time and place in history bring us face to face with profound societal impasse. We can find no escape from the world we have built, where the poor and oppressed cry out, where the earth and environment cry out, and where the specter of nuclear waste already haunts future generations. Everything is just too complex, too beyond our reach. Yet it is only in the process of bringing the impasse to prayer, to the perspective of the God who loves us, that our society will be freed, healed, changed, brought to paradoxical new visions, and freed for nonviolent, selfless, liberating action. Freed, therefore, for community on this planet Earth. So would you hold your candles one more time up to the camera? And Connie wrote this in 1983. And imagine, I'm going to read it one more time. But no, this is a purpose for what we are sitting. And it is still bringing forward the next stage of evolution for us. And we are contributing to that. So I pray, our time and place in history bring us face to face with profound societal impasse. We can find no escape from the world we have built, where the poor and oppressed cry out, where the earth and environment cry out, and where the specter of nuclear waste already haunts future generations. Everything is just too complex, too beyond our reach. Yet it is only in the process of bringing this chaos to prayer, to the perspective of the God who loves us, that our society will be freed, healed, changed, brought to paradoxical new visions, and freed for nonviolent, selfless, liberating action. Freed, therefore, for community on this planet Earth. So blow out your candle and know we continue to be with each other. Thank you.
My goodness, thank you. Thank you so much, Sister Nancy, for all that you've brought to us this afternoon. We really do appreciate the time that you spent. I also wanted to thank all of the participants in this session of Global Sisters Report's Witness and Grace Conversations, and all the Global Sisters Report and NCR, National Catholic Reporter colleagues who helped put this all together with preparation and technological wizardry that needed to take place. So thanks to each of you. And I'd ask that you watch your emails for the promised follow-up thank you, which will include, as noted, the resources and references that Sister Nancy mentioned today. And watch for upcoming notices about Witness and Grace conversations and programs. So blessings on each of you.
Thank you.
And hope that this presentation will guide you to more fruitful contemplative practice. Anything else, Nancy, before we leave?
No, just thank you very much, everyone. And I'll keep imagining seeing you when I sit down to write next time. So thank you.